bride arrived with a baby no one claimed, and a rancher who had lost everything chose them both. The desert wind carried dust like smoke from a battlefield, sweeping down the main street of Dry Creek just as the stagecoach rattled into town. Horses snorted, sweat darkened their flanks, and every boardwalk creaked under the weight of townsfolk, craning for a look. They'd heard rumors, as they always did, something about a bride coming west to marry into money. But when the door swung open, the town's collective breath hitched. A young woman stepped down, her dress travel-stained, bonnet hanging loose from her neck. In her arms was a baby, swaddled tight in a blanket the color of old cream. Its soft wail cut through the hot silence. If you're new here, subscribe to the channel and tap the bell icon. Stories like this deserve to be remembered. Clara Whitfield had the posture of a woman who had once been proud, yet the stiffness of her back betrayed exhaustion. Dust clung to her hem, and one gloved hand trembled slightly as she adjusted the baby's weight. She did not look left or right, but she felt the stares. Every whisper was a blade. At the far end of the street stood a 2-story brick house with whitewashed trim, the home of her betrothed Mr. Nathaniel Harrow, owner of the richest spread in 3 counties. He stepped forward now, tall, broad, dressed in a black suit far too fine for the desert. His jaw was set in stone. "You're late," Harrow said flatly, his voice carrying. His eyes dropped to the child, then hardened. "And you brought baggage." The crowd shifted, a ripple of scandal running through it. Clara swallowed, her throat dry as the dust. "This is my son." Her voice was clear but quiet, the kind of strength one summoned when everything else had been taken. "Not mine." Harrow's lip curled. "Nor will he ever be. I sent for a bride, not a scandal." Laughter, cruel and sharp, erupted from somewhere in the crowd. Clara's cheeks flushed crimson, but she did not lower her gaze. The baby whimpered, as if sensing the hostility that hung in the air, like heat lightning. From the edge of the crowd, leaning against the hitching post, Elias Monroe watched. His hands were rough, scarred from war and years of ranch work, his face shadowed beneath a wide-brimmed hat. Folks in town said he kept to himself out on his spread north of the river. They said he had ghosts. He'd buried men in the war, and maybe part of himself too. But when he saw the way Clara's shoulders squared against the laughter, something inside him shifted. He recognized that look, the look of someone who had been broken but refused to kneel. Harrow raised his voice. "You'll take your mistake and leave this town. No man of standing will claim you now." The words struck harder than any blow. Clara swayed, clutching her child, but she did not cry. The silence afterward was worse than the jeers. Silence could bury a soul. That was when Elias stepped forward. His boots struck the dry earth with steady rhythm, cutting through the murmurs. The crowd parted slightly, uncertain. He stopped in front of Clara, meeting Harrow's sneer with the kind of stillness that made men uneasy. "She don't need your claim," Elias said quietly, but the words carried. "And she sure as hell don't need your cruelty." Harrow scoffed, but something in Elias's eyes warned him back. War had carved lines into that face, lines no ranch wealth could smooth. Elias turned, meeting Clara's gaze. Up close, he saw the fatigue etched beneath her eyes, the defiance trembling just beneath her skin. He saw the child's tiny fist clutching at her dress, as if holding on to the only world he knew. "Ma'am," Elias said, voice low enough for only her. "You've nowhere to go?" Her chin quivered, but she answered, "Nowhere." The baby's cry rose again, and Elias glanced around, the crowd gawking, whispering, ready to watch her be driven out. Something in him clenched, the same knot he'd felt years ago when he left men behind on battlefields. He could not leave her to this. "Then you'll come with me," Elias said finally. His voice was steady, though his heart thudded heavy. "My ranch ain't much, but it'll keep you and the boy safe." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Harrow's face went red with anger. "You take another man's discarded bride? A woman sullied?" Elias didn't flinch. Better a sullied woman with a spine than a man with no honor. The silence that followed was thick as storm clouds. Clara's breath trembled in her chest, caught between disbelief and relief. Slowly, she nodded. Elias took the bundle from her just long enough to help her onto his horse, then handed the baby back. The crowd parted again as he mounted up beside her. Dust rose beneath their hooves as they rode out of Dry Creek together. An outcast bride, a child no one claimed, and a rancher who hadn't planned to take either but could not turn away. Behind them, the whispers continued. Ahead lay the wide, merciless prairie, and something neither of them had expected. The prairie stretched wide and merciless, the kind of land that measured a person's will as much as their strength. The wind hissed across dry grass, carrying the smell of sage and dust. Clara clutched her baby tighter as Elias's horse carried them north, away from Dry Creek's jeers and into the silence of open country. Hours passed beneath the sun. Elias rode ahead, reins loose in his hands, shoulders squared but heavy as if bearing some invisible weight. He said little, only pointed when a creek came into sight, or when they crested a ridge and his ranch appeared in the distance. A squat, log house with a lean-to barn surrounded by weather-beaten fences. It wasn't much, but to Clara it was more than she had when she'd stepped off the stage. When Elias dismounted, he helped her down without ceremony, but his hand lingered just long enough to steady her trembling knees. She hated that she trembled at all. "You can stay in the spare room," he said, voice gruff, avoiding her eyes. "Ain't much, but it's dry and the roof don't leak." Clara adjusted the baby's blanket. "I don't need charity." Elias's jaw tightened. "Didn't offer it." He turned toward the barn, leaving her on the porch with nothing but the sound of cicadas. The first nights were uneasy. The house creaked with old wood and prairie wind, and Clara barely slept. Every sound set her nerves on edge. The babies, restless stirring, coyotes yipping in the distance, the dull echo of Elias moving about the house in the dark. She sat in a chair by the window, rocking the child until dawn painted the sky with pale fire. Elias noticed. He saw the hollow in her eyes when she came to breakfast, the way she ate with restraint, as though she feared taking too much. He didn't speak of it. Instead, he placed a second cup of coffee on the table each morning, black and bitter, and slid the bread basket closer to her reach. Clara insisted on working. She swept, cooked, tended the garden that clung stubbornly to the hard soil. She even tried her hand at mending fence posts, though the splinter that lodged in her palm drew a rare chuckle from Elias. "You're not made for that work," he said, taking her hand gently, extracting the splinter with a steady knife. Her eyes flashed. "I can learn." His gaze lingered longer than it should have. "Reckon you can." One afternoon, Clara's shoe tore against the porch step. She muttered beneath her breath, trying to stitch it with needle and thread, but the leather defied her. Elias said nothing, simply picked the shoe up after she set it aside and carried it to the barn. Hours later, she found it by the door, stitched clean, sole reinforced. She didn't thank him aloud. Instead, she slipped it on, then looked out toward the barn, where Elias was bent over a trough, shoulders straining against the setting sun. Something tightened in her chest. The baby grew restless with the heat. Clara bathed him in a tin basin, whispering lullabies from her childhood, songs she had once sung for her little sister back in Missouri. Elias passed by the open window once, and paused. He leaned against the frame, hat in his hand, listening. His eyes softened at the sound of Clara's voice, though he didn't step inside. That night, he lingered on the porch while she rocked the child. The stars were sharp above, the kind of sky that made a man feel both small and infinite. Clara spoke without looking at him. "I'll find work soon. I won't burden you longer than necessary." Elias exhaled slowly. "Didn't say you were a burden." "You didn't have to." Her voice cracked faintly, betraying the hurt she'd carried from town. He shifted, restless. "Folks in Dry Creek, they talk because it's easier than living with their own sins. Best you don't pay mind." Clara glanced at him, searching his face. "Do you believe them?" His eyes met hers in the dark, steady as stone. "No. I believe what I see. A woman who holds her ground when the whole world tries to break her, and a child who deserves better than whispers." The silence that followed was heavier than words, thick with something unspoken. Clara looked away, cradling her son closer, but a faint warmth spread through her chest. Days passed into weeks. Life on the ranch demanded routine, feeding livestock, hauling water, repairing what the wind and time had worn down. Clara carried her child on her hip while stirring stew, or laid him in a basket of blankets while she hauled laundry to the creek. Elias worked long hours under the sun, yet he returned, each evening to find Clara at the porch, waiting. Sometimes she offered him a meal, sometimes only a glance, but each exchange stitched a thread neither spoke of aloud. The distance between them was both safety and torment. Elias told himself she was not his to claim, that the boy was not his blood. Yet when he heard the baby's laugh one morning, clear and small as a church bell, something inside him cracked open. A space he hadn't known was still alive. Clara noticed. She caught Elias once, leaning over the cradle after he thought she'd gone outside. His calloused hand brushed the blanket gently, almost reverent. She said nothing, but her heart stirred in ways she feared. One evening, thunderheads rolled across the horizon, bruising the sky. Clara hurried to bring in laundry from the line, but the wind whipped a sheet free, sending it tumbling. She chased it into the yard, clutching the baby tight, but stumbled. Before she could fall, Elias's arms caught her, steady and strong. The storm wind howled around them, sheets snapping overhead like a sail, and for a moment she leaned into him. His heart pounded against her cheek, his breath warm with words he didn't say. He set her upright, stepped back, but his hands lingered, a moment too long on her shoulders. "Careful," he said gruffly. Clara's lips parted, but she only nodded. Their eyes held until lightning split the sky. That night, when the rain beat against the roof and the prairie turned dark with water, Clara lay awake in the spare room. She could hear Elias moving in the next room, restless as she was. She pressed, her hand to her son's back, feeling his small breaths steady beneath her palm. For the first time since stepping off the stage in Dry Creek, she did not feel entirely alone. The baby's cry pierced the stillness of dawn, carrying through the thin walls of Elias's cabin like a church bell rung too early. Clara bent over the cradle, her hair loose, eyes heavy. Outside, the prairie lay in blue shadow, the world not yet awake. Elias lingered in the doorway, boots in hand, watching silently. He had meant to head to the barn, but something about the sight rooted him. Clara's lips moved in soft murmurs, words too low to catch. She pressed her cheek to the infant's head, eyes closed, rocking gently as though holding back a tide. Elias knew the look. He'd seen it in soldiers after battle, clutching at what little remained. Later that morning, Clara surprised him by asking for a ride into town. "Supplies," she said. Elias hesitated. He knew how people stared, how they whispered, but she met his eyes with a steady defiance. "They'll talk whether I'm there or not," she said. "Best I look them in the face." The general store smelled of leather, flour, and dust. Its narrow aisles were crowded with bolts of cloth and barrels stacked high. Clara moved quietly, gathering flour and beans, her baby in her arms. Elias kept near, hat low, scanning the room, but whispers rose anyway. "That her?" a woman hissed behind a shelf of calico. "Stagecoach bride, came with a bastard child. Poor Harrow, spared the shame. Or spared the expense." The words struck like stones. Clara's hand trembled as she reached for a sack of sugar. The baby squirmed, sensing her unease. The counter, the storekeep, a thin man with spectacles, cleared his throat. "We don't keep accounts for temporary residents." His glance flicked to Clara, then away. Her cheeks burned. She set the sugar down. "Then I'll pay in coin." The man hesitated, then muttered, "As you wish." But the air was thick with judgment. When a man in a cavalry coat swaggered in, spurs jangling, the whispers sharpened into silence. Clara stiffened instantly. The soldier's eyes swept the room, lingering on her with a smile too slick to trust. He tipped his hat mockingly. "Afternoon, miss. Fine boy you got there." Clara's throat closed. Her arms clutched the baby tight, breath coming sharp. Elias, watching from the corner, saw the blood drain from her face. He stepped forward before she could answer. "She ain't here for talk," Elias said, voice low, steady. The soldier's smirk faded when he recognized Elias. War left reputations, and Elias carried his like a shadow. For a moment, silence stretched. Then the soldier clicked his tongue and sauntered away. But Clara was trembling. Her breath hitched as she stared at the floor, refusing to meet anyone's eyes. Outside, once the wagon was loaded, Elias finally asked, "Who was he?" Clara's voice was flat. "Not him, but like him." She said no more, and he didn't press. But the knot in his chest tightened. That night, rain pattered against the windows. Clara sat by the fire, the baby asleep in her lap. Elias leaned against the door frame, arms crossed, watching the flames. The silence between them was heavy, filled with words unsaid. Finally, Clara spoke. Her voice was brittle, like glass ready to break. "The father," she whispered. "He wore the same uniform. A cavalry officer. We were 3 days out of St. Louis. He found me when the others slept." Her hand smoothed the baby's hair, though her gaze was fixed far beyond the fire. "He laughed when I begged him to stop. Said no one would believe me over a man in uniform." The fire popped. Elias closed his eyes briefly, a muscle in his jaw jumping. Images returned unbidden. Villages burning, native women screaming, officers laughing with whiskey on their breath. His chest felt like it might split. Clara continued, her words a thread pulled from a wound. "When I realized I carried his child, I thought, maybe still I could marry, have a home. But Harrow saw only shame, and the town saw only sin." She looked at Elias then, her eyes burning with unshed tears. "Tell me true. Do you think me ruined?" Elias's throat worked. He stepped closer, kneeling by her chair, his calloused hand braced on the armrest. "Ruined?" His voice shook with anger not at her, but at the world. "No. Wronged. Shamed by cowards. But not ruined." Her lips parted, as if to answer, but words failed. Instead, her hand brushed his, light, hesitant. He did not pull away. The days that followed, Clara's confession hung between them. Elias carried it in silence, the weight of her pain pressing against his own ghosts. When he rode out to mend fence lines, he remembered the cries of women in burning camps, the orders barked by men like the one who had taken Clara's choice. He had followed those orders once. That guilt gnawed at him. At night he dreamed of blood on snow, smoke rising from charred lodges, faces of children blurred by firelight. He woke drenched in sweat, staring at the ceiling, hearing Clara's soft voice in the next room soothing her child. The two of them lived with ghosts, though. Neither asked the other for absolution. It came to a head a week later, back in town. Clara needed medicine for the baby's cough. Elias hitched the wagon and accompanied her. The store was crowded, and again the whispers rose. This time, one man muttered loud enough for all to hear. "Woman like that ought to be sent back east. Ain't fit for decent company." The room chuckled darkly. Clara's shoulders stiffened, but she didn't bow her head. She turned, eyes blazing, but before she could speak, Elias did. His voice cracked like thunder. "Say that again." The laughter faltered. The man sneered. "Truth don't need repeating." Elias stepped forward, close enough that the air itself seemed to tighten. His eyes burned with the weight of every battle he'd survived. "That woman's got more decency in her than any man here. She stood where others would have broken. You want to call her unfit? You answer to me." Silence blanketed the store. No one moved. Finally, the man looked away, muttering. Elias held his gaze a moment longer, then turned back to Clara. Her face was pale, her hands shaking slightly as she held the baby. But her eyes shone with something Elias hadn't seen before. Trust. That evening, as the sun bled red, across the horizon, Clara and Elias sat on the porch. The baby slept in a basket between them. The wind carried the scent of rain, cool against the heat of the day. Clara broke the silence. "You risked yourself for me today." Elias stared at the prairie. "Seemed right." Her voice was softer. "No man's ever stood for me. Not like that." He turned his head, meeting her gaze. For a long moment, neither looked away. Then Clara reached down, brushing a strand of hair from the baby's brow. "Maybe we're both haunted," she whispered. Elias's chest tightened. He wanted to say more, to tell her she wasn't alone. But the words stuck. Instead, he reached out, placing his rough hand lightly over hers. The gesture spoke louder than anything. The sun sank, leaving the prairie bathed in violet shadow. Two souls, scarred by the past, sat side by side, not yet healed, but no longer alone. The first sight of him was a shadow stretching long across the dust of Main Street. A horse snorted, stamping against the earth as the sun burned overhead. Then came the officer, his blue coat sharp against the grit of the frontier, brass buttons, gleaming like a dare. Behind him, 4 cavalrymen sat tall in their saddles, their laughter carrying like broken glass on the wind. The townsfolk spilled from doorways and porches, faces tight with unease. Clara froze outside the general store, her baby pressed close against her chest. The child stirred, sensing her heartbeat thunder against his tiny ribs. Elias stepped half a pace in front of her, his jaw set, the brim of his hat shadowing his eyes. The officer dismounted with the swagger of a man who had never been told no. His boots struck the ground hard, spurs catching the light. He tipped his hat mockingly toward Clara, his grin carved with cruelty. Well, well, the runaway bride. And her protector. His eyes slid to Elias. "I heard you were playing house out here with another man's disgrace. Guess war makes some men desperate." The words landed heavy in the air. Clara's fingers clutched tighter at the baby. Her throat locked, but she refused to step back. The man who had stolen her choice, her peace, her future, stood brazen, smirking as though the world itself sheltered his crimes. Elias's voice, when it came, was low and steady. "You best keep your distance." The officer chuckled, spreading his arms wide. "Or what? You'll shoot a uniform? That'll go well for a washed-up rancher clinging to his last patch of dirt." His men laughed with him, their hands resting casually on their rifles. But beneath the mockery, whispers ran through town. Folks had seen the officer's kind of work. Rumors of raids on native camps, of children vanished, of mothers beaten until silence was all they had left. Even here, on the edge of nowhere, truth seeped through like blood in water. Clara's breath shook. She remembered the stench of whiskey on his breath, the press of his weight, the sound of boots scraping against canvas. She remembered praying for it to end, only to wake each day knowing the consequence now lay in her arms. She lifted her chin. "You ruined me," she said, her voice cutting through the crowd. "And still you laugh." The officer's smile faltered. For a moment, just a moment, the mask cracked. Then he spat in the dirt and sneered. "Careful, girl. Words like that'll get you stoned quicker than me court-martialed." Elias moved before she could blink, stepping close enough that their boots nearly touched. His hand hovered near the worn grip of his Colt. His voice was rough with memory, with every night haunted by battlefields and burning homes. "You prey on the weak. I've seen men like you before. They always meet the same end." The officer leaned in, his breath sour with tobacco. "You don't scare me, rancher. You're nothing but a ghost hiding in the hills. And ghosts don't win wars." The days after stretched taut with fear. Elias repaired fence lines with a fury that left his palms blistered. Clara carried water from the well with her jaw clenched so tight it ached. At night, the baby's cries seemed louder, sharper, as though the child too sensed the storm edging closer. One evening, as firelight flickered across the cabin walls, Elias found Clara standing in the doorway, staring out toward the dark horizon. Her silhouette trembled, though her voice did not. "I won't run again," she whispered. Elias set the tin cup in his hand down on the table. "If you stay, he'll come. He'll come with papers and soldiers to drag you back into silence. Then—" "Let him," she said, turning to face him. Her eyes glistened, but steel ran through her words. "I'm tired of being afraid of the sound of boots." For the first time since she'd arrived, Elias felt his chest loosen, though it was not relief. It was a dangerous sort of respect, born from the sight of someone standing unarmed before a storm and refusing to bow. The confrontation came days later. The officer returned, this time with twice as many men. Their horses stirred up a storm of dust that choked the air as they thundered toward Elias's ranch. Chickens scattered, the cattle bellowed from their pen. Clara rushed outside, the baby clutched close as Elias grabbed his rifle from its rack. The officer dismounted, his eyes sweeping the land like it already belonged to him. "You've had your fun," he called. "Hand her over, no sense dying for a woman who ain't even yours." Elias stepped onto the porch, rifle steady in his hands. The wood creaked beneath his boots, the air thick with the scent of dust and fear. Clara stood behind him, her hand brushing his arm. Not to stop him, just to let him know he wasn't alone. "Turn back," Elias said. His voice carried, strong as the wind cutting through the plains. "You won't set foot past this fence." The officer laughed, drawing his pistol with a flourish. "You think you can scare me? You, a man hiding behind another man's shame?" But the townsfolk had followed. They stood at the edge of the ranch, silent witnesses. They had seen enough of the officer's cruelty. They had seen Elias carry scars yet never strike at the weak. Whispers rose, not for the officer but for the rancher standing tall against him. Elias aimed his rifle, the weight of choice heavy in his chest. To pull the trigger meant war with the cavalry. To lower it meant surrendering Clara back into hell. The wind shifted, carrying the cry of Clara's baby into the silence. Elias's finger tightened. The standoff stretched until even the horses grew restless. Then slowly the officer holstered his pistol, though his grin never faltered. "This isn't over," he spat. "The West remembers men who cross the army." He swung onto his horse, his men following. Dust swallowed them whole as they rode away, but the shadow of their return lingered heavy in the fading light. Elias lowered his rifle, the wood slick in his hands. Clara exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. For the first time, their eyes locked not as strangers bound by circumstance, but as two people who had chosen the same fight. As the sun bled into the horizon, painting the sky in fire and gold, Clara shifted the baby in her arms and whispered, "We stand then, together." Elias nodded, though the weight of what lay ahead pressed against his heart like stone. The prairie wind rose, carrying with it the smell of sage and dust, a reminder of the battles behind them, and the ones yet to come. The first spark of violence was not from a gunshot, but from fire. The barn went up like dry tinder beneath a summer sun, flames snapping hungrily as smoke clawed at the night sky. Horses screamed inside, the sound tearing through the silence of the prairie. And then came the rifles, muzzles flashing in the dark, bullets slamming into wood and earth with merciless rhythm. Elias Monroe crouched low behind the split-rail fence, rifle braced against his shoulder. His lungs burned with smoke, his pulse steady despite the storm unfurling around him. He had known this moment was coming from the instant he first faced that officer in town. War had a way of following men like him, even long after he'd sworn to lay down his gun. Inside the cabin, Clara pressed the baby into a hollow she dug beneath the floorboards, wrapping him in quilts to shield him from smoke. Her hands trembled, but her resolve did not. She kissed his brow once, whispered a prayer that was half broken sob, half command to survive, then rose to her feet. When she stepped outside, rifle in hand, firelight painted her face in bronze and ash. Elias saw her and felt a jolt deep in his chest. Not surprise, but recognition. She wasn't the trembling woman abandoned on the stagecoach steps weeks before. She was steel-forged in humiliation and pain, and tonight, she chose to fight. Checker, cavalry officer's voice boomed above the chaos, smug and commanding even as bullets split the air. "Burn him out! Smoke the coward from his hole! The woman is mine!" Elias fired back, dropping one of the soldiers from his horse. The man fell, with a cry, his body thudding into the dirt, but another took his place. Elias ducked as splinters exploded from the porch beam beside his head. Clara knelt beside him, loading cartridges into the spare rifle with hands that shook but did not falter. The baby's muffled cries carried faintly from within the cabin, twisting her heart with every sound. She handed Elias the rifle, her voice ragged but firm. "They'll come through the fire. They always do." Elias glanced at her, sweat streaking through soot on his face. "Then we make them pay for every step." The officer himself advanced through the haze, his silhouette clear against the burning barn, flames reflected in his brass buttons, turning him into something almost spectral. He fired twice, one bullet grazing Elias's arm, the other shattering a window of the cabin. Elias staggered back, pain flooding him, but Clara steadied him with a hand against his chest. "You're bleeding," she said. He gritted his teeth, raised his rifle. "Not enough to stop me." And then, Clara rose from cover. Her shot cracked the air, striking the hat clean off one soldier's head and sending him scrambling for cover. For a heartbeat, the line of cavalrymen faltered, startled by the sight of a woman standing shoulder to shoulder with the rancher they sought to destroy. "You picked the wrong home," she shouted, her voice breaking but fierce. "And the wrong woman." The fight dragged on, each second stretched to eternity. Horses reared, bullets sang, fire roared as the barn collapsed inward. The heat was suffocating, flames licking higher with each gust of wind. Smoke stung their eyes, but still Clara and Elias fought, two souls bound by defiance. At last the officer charged forward, revolver raised, teeth bared in a wolfish grin. He bellowed Elias's name, his boots striking sparks from the dirt. Elias tried to raise his rifle, but his wounded arm betrayed him, the weapon heavy as stone. The officer's gun barked. Elias staggered, a crimson bloom spreading across his side. Clara screamed, rushing forward as he crumpled to one knee. Time slowed. Smoke curled like ghosts around them. The officer loomed, revolver aimed at Elias's skull. His smile was victory itself, and then Clara pulled the trigger. The recoil slammed into her shoulder, but her aim was true. The officer's chest burst red. His grin collapsed into a grimace, then into nothing at all. He fell to the dirt with a weighty thud, his revolver slipping from his lifeless hand. Silence swept the battlefield, broken only by the crackling fire. Surviving soldiers froze, their leader gone, their courage extinguished. One by one they mounted their horses, retreating into the night without another word. The flames of the barn lit their flight, shadows swallowed by prairie darkness. Clara dropped the rifle, rushing to Elias as he bled into the dust. She pressed her hands to the wound, tears cutting clean tracks through the soot on her face. "Stay with me," she begged. "Please, stay." Elias's breath rattled, but his eyes found hers. Even through pain, there was no fear in them, only a tired kind of peace. "You fought," he whispered. His voice was raw but steady. "You didn't bow." Her tears fell. Harder, her hands slick with his blood. "Not without you." He reached up with trembling fingers, brushing ash from her cheek. "Then maybe there's still something worth living for." The barn was gone, reduced to blackened beams, but the cabin still stood. Smoke hung low over the land, mingling with dawn as the first pale light of morning bled across the horizon. Clara pulled Elias to the porch, her strength nearly spent, and together they watched the sky shift from ash-gray to gold. The prairie wind carried away the smell of smoke, replacing it with sage and soil. The baby's soft cry rose from inside the cabin, alive, untouched. Clara leaned her forehead to Elias's, closing her eyes against the weight of all they had endured. Fire had taken so much, but fire had also revealed what neither had dared, to speak aloud. That survival meant more than breath. It meant choice, and they had chosen each other. The last ember of the barn hissed into silence. The West would remember the night Elias Monroe's ranch burned, and the night Clara Whitfield stood unbroken. Morning came with the smell of smoke still clinging to the air. The prairie was quiet, too quiet for a land that had seen such fury only hours before. Blackened timbers jutted where the barn once stood, and the earth was scarred with ash. But the cabin still stood, stubborn against the horizon, a survivor like the two souls within. Elias Monroe sat propped against the porch post, a bandage wrapped tight around his side. Each breath was ragged, but he was alive. Clara knelt beside him, damp cloth in hand, cleaning the soot from his face. She worked in silence, her movements careful, almost reverent. Neither spoke of the night before, the fire, the officer's fall, the blood spilled into the soil. Some wounds could not be spoken into healing. They simply existed, deep and invisible, stitched together only by time and shared endurance. The baby stirred inside the cabin, letting out a small cry. Clara rose, her dress still streaked with ash, and lifted him into her arms. She rocked him gently, humming low, a sound both lullaby and promise. Elias watched her, his eyes heavy with exhaustion, but something softer than pain lingered there too. By midday, the town sent riders. At first, Elias thought more trouble had come, but it was only neighbors, men and women who once whispered behind hands when Clara passed, who once turned their backs when Elias came down from his lonely ranch. They dismounted in silence, taking, in the charred barn, the wounded rancher, the woman clutching her child. Nobody said much. A few helped drag away the ruined beams. Another brought a sack of flour and salt pork. Respect came not in words, but in the quiet weight of their presence. Still, Elias saw how their eyes lingered on Clara's child. Whispers would never die. Not fully. But there was a difference now. Those whispers carried less scorn, more unease, because she had stood her ground when few would have dared. Clara did not shrink beneath their gaze. She held the baby steady, chin high, daring them to judge. And, perhaps for the first time since she'd stepped off that stagecoach, she no longer felt small. When evening fell, Elias and Clara sat together on the porch. The prairie wind carried the smell of sage and the faint hiss of burned wood. Fireflies winked above the grass, fragile sparks in the deepening dusk. Elias shifted, grimacing at the ache in his side. His voice, when it came, was rough but certain. "I meant what I said, Clara. You and the boy. You're not charity. You're not someone else's burden. You're mine, because I choose it." She turned to him, eyes glistening in the fading light. "Even knowing what he is? Knowing how he came to be?" Elias met her gaze, steady as the earth beneath them. "That child didn't choose the cruelty that brought him here. Same as you didn't choose to carry it. But you fought for him, and I've seen what kind of mother you are. Blood don't make a family. Choice does." Clara swallowed hard, the weight of his words settling deep in her chest. For so long she had braced for rejection, for shame, for exile. Yet here sat a man scarred by his own ghosts, offering not possession, but belonging. She placed the baby in his arms. Elias held the child carefully, awkwardly, as though afraid his calloused hands might harm him. But the infant only cooed, clutching at Elias's shirt with tiny fists. For the first time in years, Elias smiled, a faint, weary smile, but real. The prairie stretched out before them, endless and uncertain, the horizon painted in gold as the sun sank behind the hills. Clara rocked gently in the chair, humming as the baby drifted to sleep. Elias sat beside her, the child against his chest, the two of them framed by a sky that promised both hardship and hope. Their scars would remain. The past would never vanish. But the silence between them was no longer empty. It was full, forged in fire, carrying the fragile weight of a home they had chosen together. And in that silence, there was peace. That was my story. If it reached you, tell me what you felt. Don't let silence bury us again. Drop your thoughts in the comments, and tell me where in the world you're listening from.